Hi Year 3 and welcome to another instalment of Harry the Poisonous Centipede. Okay, let's have a look where we left off last week. It was an exciting place, I remember. Okay, so do you remember this picture of Harry and George climbing up the foot that they didn't realise was a foot? Okay, so we're going to start with chapter 26, the Meat Mountain today. Okay, off we go. They climbed up a straight place that had wrinkles on it, which made it easy to climb. It was the sole of a foot, but they didn't know that. When they got to the top, they slipped between two knobbly things. These were toes, but they didn't know that. They ran down a gentle slope, dodging between the stiff hairs, and came to a long thing, like a branch, except that it was hairy too. Here, the roof of the warm tunnel lay right on top of them and they had to push through. But they were used to burrowing, and this was easier than that. At the other end of the branch, which was a long way, they came to a smoother part. It was like a big, flat, warm, meaty floor. No hairs here. Stop a minute, said Harry. What? Panted George. Why is it going up and down? I don't know. I do, said Harry. It's breathing. That stopped George, but only for a moment. Let's go on. Grund, said Harry. Oh, what? Said George crossly. He sensed that Harry was going to say something he didn't want to hear. I think we may be climbing on a human, said Harry quietly. At these dreadful words they both crouched down in terror, but after a while George stood up again. Well, it's not doing us any harm, he said. Maybe it's dead. I sometimes think you're stupid, said Harry. It's not dead. It's warm and it's breathing. If you ask me, it's asleep. That made George brave again. Listen, he said. What's the most important thing for us right now? To get home, said Harry. No, said George. That's second most important. To get damp, said Harry. Right, said George. And I smell water. Harry moved his feelers around. He could smell it too now. It was rather a long way off, but he knew it was ahead of them, not behind. Harry knew they were doing the thing Belinda had warned him never to do. He was sure they were in terrible danger. But when a centipede feels itself drying out, nothing else seems to matter except getting damp. All right, he said at last. Let's head for it. When we're damp, we'll be able to think better. They began to run across the flat, meaty floor towards the moist smell. 27. The lovely wet tunnel. They passed a nice little nest on their way, just the right size for one of them to curl up in. It was a tummy button, of course, but they didn't know that. They were both very tired by now. George got into the little round nest and turned around in it several times. When he curled up tight, it just fitted him. You can't rest now, Grund, crackled Harry. We must go. Suddenly there was an upheaval. Something came down hard on top of the warm web above the little round nest. Huge hard things moved around, prodding and scratching, and the whole vast meat mountain they were on heaved and shook. George shot out of the nest just in time. The two centis clung together. Then, as the prodding things went on digging and rubbing at the little round nest, they scattered and ran. They ran through a heaving forest of hairs. This was tricky for them. The hairs grew so thickly here they had to push through. Several times their little claw feet got caught on the hairs and they had to pull free. The hairy forest moved up and down even more than the hairless floor, even after the whole meat mountain had stopped heaving about. And then the noise started. It was a rumbling, gurgling, growly sound, a little like thunder, but wetter. It happened, then stopped. Then it happened again. It kept on happening. Oh, what's that noise? Asked Harry fearfully. But George didn't even bother to answer. His cuticle was feeling drier and drier. His breathing holes were all dry around the edges. His feelers, back and front, were so dry he felt they might snap off if he bumped into them. He could sense the water. It was getting nearer. Nothing else mattered. He made for it, and Harry, though quaking with fear, followed. At last they came out of the forest and found a meaty ridge in front of them. There was no warm web tunnel roof over their heads now. They were in the open. They ran along the ridge. There was a great curly, complicated bit of meat at the top. They found a tiny tunnel in the middle and stood for a moment, peering in. Should they go down it? But the moist smell was not coming from there. It was close by, though. They ran over a prickly slope, and suddenly there it was, a round hole, rather like the top of the up pipe, only it was made of warm meat. They stopped on the edge and peeped in. The noise was coming from here, and it was very loud, but they just didn't care. Oh, a lovely wet tunnel, breathed Harry. Oh, hooks, we made it, said George. Let's go, they both cried together, and they threw themselves down into it. For about 2 beautiful seconds they ran along the inside of the tunnel, getting themselves gloriously damp again. 2 seconds was all they had. After that, everything started to happen. Chapter 28, The Earthquake. In the country where the centipedes lived, there were sometimes earthquakes. Not very big ones, but the Centis knew about them, knew what happened when the earth shook and the tunnel roofs fell in and you had to dig yourself out. What happened when they were in the wet tunnel was worse than the worst earthquake they'd been through or could imagine. First of all, the tunnel suddenly seemed to jump, a very big jump, not a little jump. The 2 Centis clung on to a big wet thing inside their tunnel with their 42, well, 84 counting both of them, feet, but not for long, because suddenly they were flying through the air, not just flying nicely like a bird on the breeze, but like a cork flying out of a bottle, like a bullet fired from a gun. Well, not quite that fast, but it felt that fast to them. Of course, you can guess what had happened. They'd popped down into the sleeping Hoomin's mouth, and he had felt them running around, and it had wakened him, and he had leapt up and spat them out as hard as he could. Of course, you and I can think of nothing much worse than having a couple of centipedes crawling around inside our mouths. The poor old Hoomin, you might think. No wonder he spat them out and sent them flying through the air. But think of poor Harry and George. They had 42 feet apiece, but they didn't have wings. Flying through the air was almost the worst feeling they'd ever had, even worse than nearly drowning. But it didn't last as long. A moment, that's all. Then they landed back on the bed. Luckily it was soft. They weren't hurt, just frightened out of their wits. They ran around in circles for a minute or 2, and then suddenly it was bright time. Light flooded them. They crouched down. Then a shadow fell on them. They both knew what they had to do when a shadow fell on them. Run, run, run! Okay, we're going to leave it there. So I hope that you've enjoyed the rest of those 3 chapters that we've read. We will definitely read some more of the story next week as well. I'm really enjoying this story. I can't wait till we get to the end and find out all the other adventures that are happening with George and Harry. Okay, we'll see you on Zoom in the next few days and have a lovely week.